Hello, hello, hello. This is Jason Allen with Keller Williams Luxury Homes in Palm Springs, California. And as a California realtor, I feel it important to point out some changes that have occurred in the marketplace. I'm going to do two videos. This one talks about what buyers need to know, and the other will be what sellers need to know. And by change environment, many have heard of a lawsuit that happened called Sitzer Burnett. It was in another state. California actually had addressed the concerns of that lawsuit more than 20 years ago. However, because of that settlement and the Department of Justice's influence over the settlement, California has modified its rules. Some of these will become law as of January 1, if all things go as expected through the legislature. But proactively, we are making changes. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to pull up my notes. You won't get to see them. I do have 10 things to go over. And the first one is that buyers are now going to have to hire their own agent. You say, wait a minute, Jason, I always had an agent when I bought a property, or I knew I had to have an agent when I buy a property. True. The difference is that as of today, you will have to have a written agreement with your agent representative. And that agreement has got to spell out how your agent is going to get paid. And that means that as you negotiate that, you're going to come to clarity on what you have to pay your agent for your representation. This was a key element in the lawsuit that sellers should not have to pay by default for the buyer representation. Now, here's something to keep in mind, that you get to negotiate that. And one of the things you get to negotiate with your buyer's agent is the length of time of the agreement. Most people focus on how much the agent is going to get paid. Really, there are other elements to it. So for example, you may decide to hire an agent for a week, have that agent show you 3 properties. And if you buy one of those properties, great, that agent is going to represent you. But in that week time, you might discover your agent really doesn't know the market the way you expected. And therefore, your agreement expires and you get to go hire someone else. So keep that in mind. Now, in as much as the seller is not automatically going to pay the buyer's agent, it doesn't mean that your buyer's agent, can't ask the seller as part of your offer to pay their compensation. In order to do that, you as the buyer and your agent have to have your agreement in place before the offer is made. And then the seller can accept or reject that term of the agreement. When is that going to be relevant? If you're in what's classically called a buyer's market and a seller really hasn't had any offers or has very few offers, they recognize that a buyer's agent needs to be paid. They're doing a job. If it's a seller's market like we had during COVID throughout most of the country, and a seller has, 5, 6, 7, 10 offers to look at, they may counter an offer based on the buyer asking for the seller to pay their agent. In which case, then you as the buyer are going to be responsible for paying your agent. And then this is an important point. The agreement you sign with your buyer's representative is enforceable. So, and I'm not expecting, everyone to do this, but there will be 1 in 1,000, some number of people will think that if the seller is not going to compensate my agent, I'll fire my agent and then just go to the seller directly and make an offer and thereby cut out that percentage or flat fee that my agent was going to charge me. The agreement you sign is enforceable. That agent will be able to pursue you if you purchase that home during the time of that agreement or the extension period that the agreement includes. So for example, you may sign a 1-week agreement with an agent, but there will be an additional field on your buyer representation agreement that will have 30, 60, 90, 120 days, some length of time that says any of the properties that I showed you, and certainly the properties that you made an offer on, if you go back and buy, even though our agreement period has ended, If it's within this extended portion, I'm going to come after you for the commission. Now, look, honest people don't have to worry about things like this. People that are working in good faith don't have to worry about things like this. But remember, if your agent that you hire is doing work for you, they deserve to be compensated. Um, Now, let's assume you hire an agent, you make an offer, and the offer includes the seller paying your agent's fee. And the seller says, well, I'm not going to pay that. I'll pay half, or I'll pay none of it. Would you, as a buyer, be able to go back to your representative and say, look, they're only going to pay half. Will you take half? Yes, you can attempt to make that argument. You can attempt to renegotiate it. Will some agents agree to that? Perhaps. Yes, I'm sure some will. Would I? No. If I can't negotiate my own commission or flat fee with a client, how and why would you expect me to be able to negotiate on your behalf when I'm in a heated negotiation with the seller? So I just don't think it reflects well on an agent that's willing to do that. Is it going to happen? I'm sure it will. That's part of the process. But just keep in mind, it's a little bit like sort of renegotiating your vows on the altar. You kind of want to have all that established before that moment. And so if you feel like you can't afford whatever it is you've negotiated or your prospective agent representative charges, maybe it's important for you to go find another agent. And just keep in mind that sometimes in life you get what you pay for. An agent who is newer in the business, maybe hasn't seen all the tricks of the trade, they may be willing to accept a lower commission amount or a lower flat fee amount. I don't know. Let's see. Okay, now let's get into some other stuff that's going to become important. If you want to schedule a private appointment with a listing agent to see a property, you're either going to have to go through that listing agent, and then they're going to read you some stuff that I'm going to go over in a little bit, or you're going to contact your buyer representative. Now, let's say you don't have a buyer representative yet. You're still kind of meeting agents and interviewing. You may certainly go and work directly with that seller's agent. And then you're going to have a conversation with them. You may end up hiring them. We'll talk about that. Just keep in mind that if you do have a buyer representation agreement, it's best to go through your agent. If you do go directly to a selling agent, or I should say a listing agent, be sure to tell them you have signed a buyer representation agreement. That's going to be very important. And it will be material if you later try and hire that listing agent to represent you. And I'll tell you that a lot of agents are still learning the rules of the trade here. This is all new. They may forget to ask you if you have an existing agreement. And here's the risk. You could wind up in a situation where you actually owe two different agents a fee for representation. Even though the buyer's agent that you hired and signed an agreement with you didn't participate in that deal, you have an agreement with them. Think of it as hiring two plumbers to do the same job, and you schedule one on Monday and one on Tuesday, and the plumber on Tuesday shows up and says, well, you hired me. I booked the 4 hours to do this. I'm going to have to bill you. It's that kind of a situation. Okay, so here's what's kind of interesting when we get into open houses. You can go to any open house you want. There are no prohibitions around that. You don't have to have a buyer agency agreement or a buyer representation agreement with your own agent. However, when you walk in, you will be presented with this form. This is called the Open House Visitor Non-Agency Disclosure and Sign-In. Let me just say, if it's this form with the property address that's at the top, a date, and the agent's name and their brokerage, go ahead and sign it. Now, obviously, this may change in 6 months, a year, but if we're talking about this form with a 724 revision, go ahead and sign it. And you can read it. This will be on the screen while I go through the points. But here's what it's saying. One, the open house agent does not represent you. Very clear. You're not signing an agreement with them. In fact, they only represent the seller's interests in that moment. That means any communication you have with that agent is strictly for the benefit of the seller. I'll explain where that matters in a moment. Furthermore, any communication with that agent is not confidential. That agent can take whatever you say and tell the owner that. So if you're thinking about buying the property, for example, and you love the house, that agent can communicate that to the seller. Next, if you as the visitor want to have that agent who's showing the house that day represent you, two things are important. When they do that, they're going to disclose to you their agency relationship. It's a little bit more complicated, but the basic point is that agent could write an offer for you and you're not represented and they're only representing the seller, in which case they would disclose their agency as exclusively to the seller. If, however, you come to the next point and you want to actually hire that agent, then you're going to have to sign that buyer representation agreement or another form, which is an option, and they can present that to you. In which case, that agent would have an agency to both the seller and to you, assuming the agent showing the property is the listing agent. So, in other words, sometimes within one brokerage, an agent may show a property, they're there on behalf of the seller, but they don't actually have that listing. I do it sometimes if I can't, say, host an open house on a Saturday or Sunday for one of my listings. A colleague of mine will be there. And in fact, they're there in an interest to meet unrepresented buyers. So, all of that is to say, you can go into an open house, you'll see this form, you can sign it, you may put a check mark or a note, do not contact me. If you're concerned about the agent on duty calling you later, writing to you, putting you on a mailing list, that sort of thing. The important part is that you are acknowledging these conditions for going through the house. Now, there's going to be some buyers who will visit an open house looking specifically to see if they're asked to sign this. And the agents that are not asking you to sign this are in jeopardy. And here's why. They're not making clear to you that they are there for the seller's benefit. So when we go back to the communication and we say the communication is not confidential, I made a reference to how you might talk about how you love the house. Part of the lawsuit settlement was that buyers would show up at an open house or contact a the listing agent asked to be shown the property, and they have the impression that that agent is representing them. And so while it comes down to money and who's paying whom, it really comes down to clarification in the marketplace so that a buyer understands who their representation is. And why is that important? Is because once you sign a relationship agreement, whether it's a listing or a buy side, that agent has a fiduciary responsibility to their client. And if you don't know what that means, it essentially means the agent can only work in the client's best interest. They can't put their own interests ahead of the client's. They can, and it's information is confidential to the extent that an agreement does not allow the agent to disclose information. So, for example, in the listing agreement, it does say that an agent can disclose to a prospective buyer or buyer's agent that we're in contract, that's required, but we're in contract for X, which is higher, lower at the listing price. And the listing agent is doing that because they feel it's in the best interest of their client. Why would that be the case? If I have a listing and we're in contract at 10% over the asking price, and I think that the other agent needs to know that because their buyer isn't willing to pay more than 10%, I need to tell them, well, it should start with a 9. It should start with a million. If it's under a million, don't waste your time. That sort of communication is in my client's best interest, but I am specifically permitted to do that based on the agreement that has been written down between myself and the seller. Likewise, in the buyer representation agreement, which I wholeheartedly invite you to read thoroughly so you understand what it says, there are certain terms that enable your agent representative to disclose to the other side in the course of a negotiation. So those are the 10 things that are important. I'm going to end it there. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to try and answer those questions. And as always, I'll see you here with my next video pretty soon. Take care.